Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings to the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to Thou Orb Aloft, Full-Dazzling, poem number 1 of the 22 of From Noon to Starry Night. Now, in this poem, we're going to celebrate the sun. But notice that in From Noon to Starry Night, the very first poem will be a celebration of the sun, and the very last poem will be moon in sky night. This idea that we're going to start with sun and end with moonlight will be an important part of the trajectory, if you will, of this set of lines. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt, and that you've been with us from the very beginning. The inscriptions poems, we're going to mention eidolons a couple of times in this poem, and up through and including a set of introductory comments for introduction to Starry Night. Now, Whitman, interestingly, Whitman was actually at the Stafford Farm in New Jersey from 1876 to 78, recovering from a stroke, as we have commented on that terrible year of 73 when the stroke happened. And he apparently used the sun and sitting in the sunshine as a way of trying to help him to ameliorate. Now, our Nortons will tell us about this text, as we often will do, that this text was published in the American of June 4th, 1881, under the title, A Summer Invocation. That word will actually get used here, so we're obviously back to our Homer and to the invocation of the Muse. Included under its present title in Leaves of Grass, 1881. In a diary note of May 1881, Whitman records, quote, "Received back today the manuscript of the little piece of A Summer's Invocation," this poem, "which I had sent to Harper's Magazine. The editor said he returned it because his readers wouldn't understand any meaning of it," end quote. It reminds me of what T.S. Eliot's, the response to T.S. Eliot's love song of Geoffrey Prufrock from Ezra Pound, who said that he struggled to understand the poem, but he understood right away that it was the product of genius. Yet the poem is clearly a hymn to the sun, invoking its creative, fructifying light to strike through these chants into the twilight and starry nights of his descending life. It's one of the better poems of the autumnal years. Autumnal meaning, again, as we've said, this last 4 clusters of Leaves of Grass, roughly 130 poems, is all Whitman coming to terms now with his soon-to-be departing, right? The poet suggests several places other titles, including Sun Up and a Seashore Invocation. No doubt the ocean will play a role in this poem as well. Now, just to remind, as we take a look at this poem, the first thing is, do you remember Give Me the Splendid Silent Sun? So clearly we've got poetry about the sun. Now we're going to call this an apostrophe, that is to say, a statement to an inanimate or non-human object, in this case the sun. Go back and think about Lord Byron's apostrophe to the ocean in Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. We've talked about it at learnstrong.net. This is also an invocation or a prayer, which takes us to the poems Gods, The Last Invocation, Look Down, Fair Moon, and Prayer of Columbus. And you'll remember in Prayer of Columbus that we commented at that dramatic monologue that it's fundamentally a prayer to deity, right? So in this invocation, in this apostrophe, we will play the game of celebrating the sun. Thou orb, this will take us back to the O cause. You'll remember, thou orb of many orbs. Thou orb aloft, full-dazzling. Go back to Song of Myself 46. We must habit ourselves to the dazzle of the light. Thou hot October noon. It's interesting, again, autumnal. It's interesting that it's not a summer noon, but rather it's an October noon. Flooding with sheeny light. You'll remember sheeny when we come back to it. It stands at 70, a font of type. Sheeny light. The gray beach sand. Now, for sure, when you remember, guys, when we were doing drum taps, remember I said, always focus on his use of coloration in Leaves of Grass. So notice it's the gray beach sand. The sibilant near sea. Hear all the S sounds in this poem, by the way. As I ebbed, you'll remember sibilant was used. The sibilant near sea with vistas far and foam, obviously the ocean, and tawny streaks and shades and spreading blue. By the way, this spreading blue reminds you of the myriads that are referenced in Shelley's Ode to the West Wind. O sun of noon refulgent My special word to thee. By the way, refulgent only gets used one time in All Leaves of Grass, and it's right here. My special word to thee. It will be a word, it will be an invocation, it will be a prayer, it will be a celebration. And then sounding very much like Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, hear me illustrious. Thy lover, me, go back to Lord Byron's apostrophe to the ocean, Childe Harold's pilgrimage. Thou lover, me, for always I have loved thee. It's almost a lifted line right out of apostrophe to the ocean of Byron. Even as basking babe, hear the B sounds now in this line. Even as basking babe, that happy boy, think about a child went forth, alone by some wood edge, thy touching distant, notice hyphenated, beams enough. This idea from Tintern Abbey that I think he learned from his study of Wordsworth, you'll remember this, that he says about nature, there was no need of a remoter charm by thought supplied. When you're a child, that it's enough to just have the sun coming down on you. Or man matured, or young or old, as now to thee I launch my invocation. And you'll remember the last invocation in Whispers of Heavenly Death, the same is used. And then in parentheses, as we've seen him so regularly do, thou canst not with thy dumbness me deceive. There's been a lot made of the syntax, the word order that is being played out in this poem and elsewhere in Leaves of Grass. And then with epistemology, the first of our big five, I know before the fitting man all nature yields. Of course, we think of Emerson's classic essay, Nature, and I think Whitman is channeling that essay. We gave full lectures on it at learnstrong.net. Though answering not in words, again, this is part of that translinguistic mysticism that he's always talking about. The skies, trees, hear his voice, and thou, O sun, to take us back to earlier, O sun. As for thy throes, thy perturbations, remember he uses this phrase in this word in Eidolon's terrible perturbations of the suns. Thy perturbations, sudden breaks and shafts of flame gigantic. This idea of using the word gigantic, I think he borrows this from Milton's Paradise Lost. The idea that size always seems to matter. How do you describe the sun? How do you speak to the size of the sun? Notice it is a flame, by the way. In what ways has flames been the way that Whitman will present his theodicy? Go back to our study of drum taps, for example. He says, I understand them. I know those flames, those perturbations well. That is to say, to gain any insight, you have to have the flame, right? And that takes us back, obviously, to our study of Plato and to the Republic, and especially Book 7, the cave allegory. And now, to the next stanza. Thou that with fructifying heat and light, think about calling this collection of poems Leaves of Grass, celebrating growth, and then using the word fructifying. You'll remember this as well, used one other time in Mother of Thy Equal Brood, Part 5. Or myriad farms. Now we're going to give this kind of big picture view. The sun and the sunshine over myriad farms, or lands and waters, north and south. Or notice the three here: Mississippi's endless course, or Texas' grassy plains, or Canada's woods. Notice going north to south. I told you guys, dimensionality will factor in almost every one of the poems in this collection, this cluster. Or all the globe that turns its face, think about the next poem, Faces, that turns its face to thee, shining in space. Again, hear all these S sounds. That thou impartially enfoldest all. Now, this word enfoldest gets used only one time in All Leaves of Grass. However, we commented from the very beginning, the power of notions of hugging, grasping, clinging, here, enfolding. Not only continents, seas, thou that to grapes and weeds and little wild flowers gives so liberally. You'll remember this word weeds back in Song of Myself 33, I fall on the weeds. It's significant, right? Leaves of grass and weeds. And the little wildflowers give us so liberally. In other words, the sun is always shining on everything in nature. And then he'll use back to back this word, shed thyself on mine and me. Now, again, go back and look at our study of Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, and the way in which, at the very end of that poem, he makes his request to the wind, not only to listen, but to do something important in terms of artistic creation. Here, we're playing the same game of inspiration. It's a very old game. Shed thyself on mine and me, with but a fleeting ray out of thy millions. I told you how he loves to talk about size through numbers. strike through these chants. And, you know, I mean, this takes us all the way back to the Homeric tradition, which I think he's channeling big time when he talks about rosy-fingered dawn and all of that. And notice here, this idea of striking is an interesting use of the word. It can be a physical word, as in a martial strike, as in drum taps when we saw it there. Or it can also be strike up the drum or strike the beat, as in music. Strike through these chants. Again, we're back to Shelley's Ode to the West Wind 5 for sure here. Nor only launch thy subtle dazzle. Again, we're back to launching again. Song of Myself 44. You'll remember, I launch all men and women forward with me and into the unknown. So here we're using it. Obviously, Passage to India comes to mind. Nor only launch thy subtle dazzle. You'll remember the use of the word subtle for the first time in starting from Almanac 11. And then we're back to dazzle at the very beginning. And of course, we must have it ourselves to the dazzle of the light from Song of Myself 46. And thy strength for these. In other words, he's calling on the sun to inspire him in some way. Obviously, there's a bit of Egyptianology as well going on here, and the celebration by in Egyptian myth of the sun. And then 3 prepares. Prepare the later afternoon. Notice we begin at noon, now we're in the afternoon. Of me, myself, dash, thinking of Emily Dickinson, right? Prepare my lengthening shadows. Now, of course, the minute we hear shadows, we're thinking about Republic, Plato's Republic 7 and the cave allegory. But shadows as well now, we're in October. We're coming to the end. Again, autumnal. Prepare my starry nights. Again, A Clear Midnight will be the final poem of this collection. So we will begin with the sun, we will end with the moon, and in between we've got this amazing collection of these 22 poems that will play with all kinds of understandings of dimensionality and the like. Well, what are we going to say at 2a, and what are major themes and messages here? Well, I think that one of the arguments he's making is that all of life is about energy, and of course the greatest exemplar of that is the sun itself. Notice as well, you can't have any growth without sunshine, just like you can't have any spiritual, intellectual, or cognitive growth without the flames of challenges. This is his theodicy. When terrible things or suffering happens, don't ask why did it happen to me, but rather why did it happen for me? What can I learn through this experience? At 2b, we've mentioned already the power of the apostrophe here. At 3a, we've mentioned Shelley's Ode to the West Wind and Byron's apostrophe to the ocean and Emerson's nature. But I'd also like to throw into this list as well any number of poems by Emily Dickinson, and of course Thoreau's Walden, where he will do very similar kinds of things, talking about the stuff we take for granted, and yet it's so unbelievably necessary in our lives. Finally, at 3b, a couple of questions to try and own a poem like this. Do you love the sun? What's your relationship to the sun? Some of you maybe will say, man, too much sun, I just can't handle it. Others of you will say, give it to me all the time. And how about this one? What flames have helped you grow in your life? It's my hope that your study of Leaves of Grass is part of those flames, inspired by the sun. Thank you.